The Reign of the Long Tusks by Stanton A. Coblentz. This story was only ever published in the February 1937 issue of Astounding Stories magazine. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel Quasar Spectra. The Reign of the Long Tusks. Introduction. The following account was discovered years ago among the weather-beaten rocks of a cavern in the Austrian Tyrol. Composed in a singular form of picture writing, or hieroglyphics, it covered many square yards of the dark cave surface, and though much of it had been nearly obliterated by the action of time and the elements, still enough was legible to make a corrected narrative, and one sufficient to alter our ideas of prehistoric man. For it turned out to be the record of a vanished and previously unknown race. The deciphering of the characters, a task in which I have been engaged for the past 2 decades, was indeed a work of Herculean proportions. But now that I've mastered the inscriptions, I feel rewarded even beyond my expectations. It is true that the new conceptions of early man revealed by my researches will not be easily accepted by orthodox scientists. It is true that it is difficult even for me to credit the fact here set forth beyond all questions that man was not always supreme upon the earth, and that, except for an accident, he never would have been supreme, but would have bowed beneath the kingship of one of the so-called lower animals. But let me not anticipate by my comments. Let me merely repeat the story as I translated it from the rock writings of Wu, son of Jabu, the Red Bear of the tribe of the Round Hill Dwellers of the North Woods. The Story on the Cave Wall. This is the story whispered into our ears by our fathers, who had it from their fathers, who had it from their fathers' fathers, of a time so long ago that no man can remember. It is the story of how our people were not always free, as today, to hunt the stag and the aurochs, but were the slaves of a much larger and more powerful animal, from which they rarely even dreamed of escaping. In those far-off days, nothing was as now, when whole mountains of ice creep down from the north, and everything grows white and bitterly cold for many moons each year, and we must fight with the wolf for our prey, and sometimes are ourselves devoured by the howling pack. Instead, the rivers never turned hard and stopped their flow in the season of short days, but the grass grew thicker and deeper than now in the valleys and marshlands, and the forests grew taller, and the winds were softer and gentler than in the memory of any man still living. But at that time there were not many men on earth, and those men that did exist were poor and pitiable creatures, somewhat like the hounds that we whip when they do not please us in the chase. But there was one dread monster that they thought of as their chieftain and god. He was a mighty being, and when he walked, the earth shook beneath the thunder of his 4 great legs, and his tremendous curling tusks were things terrible to see, and his great squirming trunk was stronger than the 2 arms of the strongest man, and could lift a boulder as if it were a pebble, and his eyes were small, very wise and knowing, and his huge thick form was covered with shaggy hair that made him even more horrible to behold than a wild bull or a cave bear. Of course, it is hard now to believe in the existence of such a creature, who was as tall as a small tree and was called the Long Tusk, or Mammoth, but the stories told by our fathers' fathers all say the same thing, which is that there were thousands of these great animals on the earth, and that they throve most wonderfully, and no one even dreamed that they would not thrive forever. For beside these enormous beasts, a man was little more than a rabbit. Now, the Long Tusk, they tell us, was not only a ruler, but a cruel ruler. He would go snorting through the country in great herds, and would tear up the trees and trample down the jungle just for the fun of making a loud noise. and sometimes his long curling trunk would reach out and seize a man and dash him full length upon the ground, and all the other long tusks would trumpet with joy at the deed, just as we might shout to see a hunter bring down a crow with an arrow. There was no place where our fathers could take refuge from the beasts. If they went up a tree, the long tusk would lean against it and shake them down like ripe apples. If they sought safety in caves, the long tusk might root them out as we dig out the burrow of a hare. Thus men lived in constant terror of their lives, and since they had not invented any weapons to slay their oppressors, they were not much better off than the frightened does we hunt and kill. It was easy enough for us to see why the long tusk ruled the earth, since he was so big and strong that nothing could stop him, and besides, his trunk was more useful to him than a stout pair of hands. And it is therefore not strange that this great brute should have made man his slave. It is true that man was not of much use to the long tusk, who did not need him to build houses, fetch water, or gather food, but our fathers seem to have amused the great beasts, who kept men just as our little children keep puppy dogs, as pets, to give them pleasure and perform antics to pass the time and make them laugh. Yes, the sad fact, so all the old stories say, is that man in those ancient days was little more than a toy which the long tusk tossed to his children to give them fun. The young long tusks would never tire of holding men and women in their trunks, of throwing them into the air and catching them, and of pulling their necks and legs, as our little ones pull the tails of puppies, and they used to shout and yell in glee whenever any of their victims cried out with pain. Of course, man did not thrive under this treatment, and there is no knowing how many were bruised or crushed to death in the games of their young rulers. But the great beasts thought nothing of taking human life, for they held that the only creatures with souls were the ones with long trunks and curling tusks. In return for his ill treatment, all that man got was a bundle of straw to sleep on, and leftover roots and wild nuts and fruits which his masters gathered for him and flung him in scorn. As a result of depending upon the long tusks, our fathers became less able to care for themselves. They had no arts, and had not invented even such simple tools as the hunting spear and pottery. They went about with their hairy bodies unclothed, like the beasts that ruled them, and their only possession was the language which they spoke to one another, and in which they preserved the story of their suffering. Nobody knows how long the misfortune of our people lasted, but they say it was long enough for many great trees to rise and wither away with age, one after the other. There was no one on all the earth who believed that an end to man's misery would ever come, for it would be as easy to pull down a mountain as to balk the will of the long tusk. They do say, indeed, that in the earliest times some of our fathers had fought back, but what result could they expect? There had once been a party, tradition tells us, under Qui, the gray squirrel, which had thought of putting poison into the water of the long tusk, and so winning their freedom. But one of their number had drunk the water by mistake, and so the plot was found out, and Qui and his brave followers were all stamped to death. At another time, we are told, there was an uprising under that brave man Zu, the nighthawk, who planned to dig pitfalls in which the long tusks would stumble to their death. But when they had almost completed the trap of dead leaves and twigs over a deep hole, a storm came up and uncovered their plans. And that was the end of Zu, the nighthawk. There were also some cases, it is said, in which our fathers tried to run away, but usually they were captured, brought back, and mercilessly beaten by the trunks of their captors. One or two parties did actually get away, but what became of them no one can say. As time went by, most men grew to accept their captivity, just as they accept the movement of the sun across the skies and the flow of the waters. They thought of it as something which always had been and always would be, and which it was foolish to fight against. And fathers gave way to their sons, and the sons passed, and babes grew up and became bent and gray and were no more. and all the while the herds of the long tusks trumpeted across the earth, and there was no one to challenge them. But all this, as we know, has long ceased to be. Search where you will on the earth, you will find none of the immense shaggy beasts with their long curling sabers, but you will find many men. And how did the change come about? Was it through the wit and wisdom of our fathers? Or was it that the long tusks, like some foolish tribes of men that we know, got into a war and destroyed one another? No, it was nothing so simple, but it was something very strange. Truly, the gods that rule the clouds and the storm winds are on the side of man, for it was they who came to our rescue, and it was they who helped us when nothing else could, and leaped up with such terror and fury that even the long tusk was less than a wriggling fly beneath their hands. The change, of course, took a long, long while. Many summers came and went. Generations grew up and died, while our fathers began to wonder if they were mistaken in thinking the world was not quite as of old. The gales grew brisker and more chilly in the season of short days. Little cakes of ice began to form on the lakes and rivers. The foliage of the countryside commenced to change bit by bit. Palm trees drooped and withered with the frost, and tree ferns faded and died. In their place arose a sterner northern growth of spruce and pine. Yes, the climate was changing, and with it the landscape was changing also. The vegetation was becoming less dense, and many succulent herbs and nourishing roots and fruits were waxing rarer each year. Finally, after many more seasons, a messenger brought the news that whole oceans of ice were moving down from the north, covering and destroying everything as they advanced. At first, no one believed such a foolish-sounding story, but the winters kept growing colder, and the winds lashed out with fiercer whips until the lakes grew hard and a whiteness covered all the world. And then our fathers shivered and huddled together in little grottos and hollows of the earth and prayed to God to protect them, and felt that the end of all things had come. They did not know that the Ice Kings had really arisen to save them. They did not know that this was their great test, which they would triumphantly meet. So bitter were their hardships that many of them perished in the snow and ice, and there was much wailing and lamentation. And for a long while they hardly noticed how the long tusks were suffering too. But these great beasts were not so many now as of old, and they were often hollow-eyed and thin of frame, and they ranged far through the country for the roots and shrubs to keep them alive. They no longer cared about man, or gave a thought to his queer antics, which had been wont to amuse their children. Now, for the first time, man was left to himself, for the long tusks, as they thundered through the land, trumpeting with hunger and trembling with cold, were so hard-pressed to find sustenance for themselves that they abandoned their charges and no longer attempted to feed them. Hence our ancestors would all have perished, and they had been unable to look after themselves. Many of them, as I have said, did succumb, but the sturdiest and bravest remained. In the beginning they knew no better than to comb the earth for tough roots and defend with the squirrels for the nuts of the forest. And they shivered in nakedness in caves, and had no defense against the wolf pack, which often banqueted richly from their number. It is surprising that they did not all die amid the cold and hardship of those terrible days. But our fathers, for all the feebleness of their bodies, were wiser than the beasts of the field, and after a while they began to use their brains, which had remained idle while the long tusk ruled over them, and they made some wondrous discoveries and inventions. One day they subdued the god of fire, when the lightning had set a great oak ablaze. Ever afterward they kept the precious embers burning, and used them in their caves to warm themselves with, and to frighten off the wild beasts. Even so, they were near to extinction, for by grubbing all the hours of daylight, they could barely find enough roots and herbs to keep life feebly beating in their scrawny bodies. Then Though no one knows just how it came about, some man thought of making a pointed stick which he could throw at the wild beasts in order to slay them. It was found that deer and hares, when roasted by the cavern fire, made good food and sustained the breath of life better than did the weeds of the wayside. Thus the stick was used until it became a hunting spear, and with the hunting spear man challenged even the great clawed cave bear and the powerful bellowing aurochs. All the while, there were still many long tusks in the land, but they were not so wise as man and could not capture prey, and they still wandered far in their hunger, while their food became less and less, and they were growing fewer each season. Finally, so tradition tells us, there came a day when man took revenge for his ancient captivity. Some great inventor, much the greatest that ever lived, made the bow and arrow, and with the bow and arrow man shot at his ancient master and brought him low. Since the long tusk was so large, he made an easy target, and when the great beast, stung by many arrows, would fall to earth, man would rush in with clubs and spears and slay him. Thus, for many years and for many generations, our fathers feasted on the flesh of the long tusk. They were a more dreadful enemy to him than hunger and cold. They slew him by the hundreds and the thousands, until, at last, the huge animal, with his long, curling white teeth, tramped no longer on the earth. But man was daily growing stronger, and his numbers increased, till he had spread over all the earth and was the master of all things. You've been listening to pre-1990s speculative fiction readings with a highlight on science fiction by Darrell T. Smith II. Please consider clicking the donation link in the description box. Thank you so much for your time and your imagination.